In this podcast, I'm going to reveal the evidence of a secret document, a resume of all of the associates who formed Counter-Terrorism Consultants LP based in Washington. It involves a secret CIA WACKENHUT counterintelligence assassination team, headed by DUANE CLARRIDGE, Lawrence BARCELLA, and set up under Frank CARLUCCI. And it actually is going to reveal that this is the second motive of damaging evidence that Danny CASOLARO had found, in addition to the BCCI signed checks and accounts for the transfer of the funds to Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanifar for the Iran-Contra tow missile deal. This is the most damaging document that Danny CASOLARO had. He was on his way to Martinsburg. He was confident he could bring back the head of the octopus that he was exposing, known as the secret team. So the key figures that were threatened by the evidence that Danny CASOLARO had was Frank CARLUCCI, DUANE CLARRIDGE, and the attorney, Lawrence BARCELLA. And I'm going to reveal to you in this podcast that this document is never been seen. It was in the records of Danny CASOLARO. It was accessible to the FBI, Martinsburg Police, and also the Department of Justice's investigation by Zipperstein into the motive for killing Danny CASOLARO. This is the evidence that was withheld, and it confirms the evidence of attorney Daniel Sheehan, who was in the process with the Christic Institute prosecuting the secret team, and Danny CASOLARO had telephoned Daniel Sheehan and was beginning to put all the pieces together. So this podcast is dedicated to Daniel CASOLARO and Daniel Sheehan, who was undermined by a corrupt justice system. And that's the only way you can control a government, when you control justice and they place their man, Lawrence BARCELLA, to shut down all evidence and all litigation cases that exposed the octopus. And this is the evidence to show that Daniel CASOLARO was the greatest threat to Lawrence BARCELLA, DUANE CLARRIDGE, Frank CARLUCCI, and the entire secret team. In this podcast, the summary diagrams I have here are going to cover the overwhelming evidence that Daniel CASOLARO was exposing the secret counter-terrorism company of consultants and assassins set up by the directors of WACKENHUT, together with DUANE CLARRIDGE, Lawrence BARCELLA, and working closely with Ted Shackley and Richard Secord and John Singwell, selling arms, drugs, and training the death squads down in South America. The resumes of the appropriate people are in the document that is being revealed to you today, that Danny CASOLARO is the only person that we know of had that. It was founded by DUANE CLARRIDGE, Dr. John Motley, Lawrence BARCELLA, who's the key attorney who's been working with the secret team to shut down all investigations that would expose the corruption of the secret team, and particularly all the corruption that was exposed by the Christic Institute by Daniel Sheehan. Also, Al Carter Cornick, Eugene Proper, and if I go across a little bit further, you'll see the other associates and directors are Frank McNeil and Maya Nadal. And later on, after Danny CASOLARO's death, Karen von Gerke Thompson, a CIA asset working for Murphy & Associates, owned by Daniel Murphy, who worked directly with Vice President or President George H.W. Bush Sr., and also was employed and working with Global Research International, founded and owned by John Mitchell, the attorney behind the Watergate scandal working for President Nixon, confirms that there is, during a Russian mafia laundering investigation in 1999, that it involved Al Carter Cornick and Eugene Proper, two attorneys that approached her requesting that she would assist them to set up the bank accounts in Antigua to allow them to money launder Russian mafia funds, rig banks, Bank of New York, and it's linked and owned to the banks in Antigua, the European Union Bank, and also Bank Menatep. And these are banks set up by Roman Abramovich and Alexander Kianakini, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is the founder of the Russian Federation Foundation with Henry Kissinger and Jacob Rothschild. He was also the owner of Yukos Oil and owned a modelling agency for Russian models known as Selene Modelling Agency, and you will find that that was founded together with Dr. Richard Fruse, who's also a CIA asset who testified during the investigations of the bombing of Pan Am 103, together with Lester Coleman and also Susan Lindau, a CIA asset, and Robert Bayer, that they didn't believe that it was the Libyans that had caused the bombing of Pan Am 103, but rather linked with Syrian intelligence and drug cartels working with the secret team that was being investigated by the Chuck McKee MC-10 team that were on board, and Michael Riconosciuto had extensively briefed Danny CASOLARO and has briefed myself over many years that it was Robert Booth Nichols who was the security leak that tipped off George Pender, Robert Mayhew, that the McKee team was returning with the evidence that would implicate the secret team, laundering and trafficking drugs from Lebanon, the Becker Valley, through New York on Pan Am Airlines with the Gambino Mafia. So this is an amazing coincidence that you cannot ignore. What's important though is that it turns out that Lawrence Barcella is the key lawyer who's undermining all investigations into Noriega's key witness Jose Blandon, who wanted to testify against Noriega's drugs being laundered through BCCI when the 5 directors of BCCI were arrested in Florida, money laundering his drugs and money laundering funds from Drexel Burnham Lambert through Capcom, which was Chicago Futures Exchange, which was owned by BCCI directors and the Kuwait royal family, who financed the BCCI checks, the first motive for killing Danny CASOLARO. Lawrence Barcella is appointed to represent the investigation of October's surprise. He's appointed everywhere, including the major fraud case that involves Melvin Paisley, who is involved with Operation Illwind, which I'm covering in other parts. But the part I would like to show the role of Lawrence Barcella is that he also represented the key investigations of Iran-Contra relating to Geomilitech Consultants, founded by Barbara Studley. It involved John Singlaub and Richard Secord selling AK-47s trafficked through Poland across to the Iran-Contra, together with Oliver North. It involves Robert Gray, Daniel O'Graham, General Robert Switzer, and right over here is John Carbell, who is a member of Le Circle. And there's your link, all going back to the 6th Eye, with Lawrence Eagleburger, Henry Kissinger, Ted Shackley, Vernon Walters, Alexander Haig, Michael Ledeen, and Richard Pearl. But there are also 2 Israelis, Ron Harel, Israeli Air Force, running the office in Israel for Geomilitech, and Joel Arnon, who is representing Israel Jewish community, an ambassador, and I have meetings of him with former President Gerald Ford. Isn't that a nice circle of coincidence that Lawrence Barcella is appointed to shut down this investigation and prosecutions? Well, I'm going to show you in this podcast that not only did Lawrence Barcella be involved in shutting down the WedTech investigation, which involved Victor Castellano, who is the nephew of Paul Castellano, Gambino Mafia, who's working with Albert V. Carone, and also with William Case and William Colby, Michael Hand and Ted Shackley for the Nugenham Bank. But I'm going to prove to you that in 2001 I was rescued by a man known as Nick Banasevic, who was really good to me. I had been demonstrating and asked to present encryption technologies to a delegation of ministers and officials coming from the Balkans, from Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Herzegovina, on the use of encryption technologies for the banking industry. And he was so impressed with my presentation that I gave at his office in Melbourne, Australia, that after he saw me be destroyed by the Johns Hopkins institutions, he came to my rescue. And I was employed for 2 years to help him with healthcare and science initiatives over in the Balkans and other countries throughout Asia. And he looked after me and my family. He really cared for me and considered me the most honest person he'd ever met. And over 2 years he opened up, and it's only now that I've been able to put through from the official annual reports and records that I have, having worked for him, and also what he told me. He confirmed to me that he was approached in London by George H.W. Bush, requesting him to come and work for him and assist CIA to identify the military locations of all the military bunkers that his companies had constructed for Saddam Hussein. It turns out that Nick had told me many times he lived in Libya, was a personal advisor to Colonel Gaddafi, built the military bunkers for Saddam Hussein, and then requested to move his company across to Virginia. And I have the registration addresses, telephone numbers of all his companies in Virginia. And then I did a search, and Nick passed away a few years ago now, and he was very good to me. He felt sympathetic that I'd been destroyed, but he knew what was involved. I didn't at the time, and this is what I've uncovered. I found the newspaper articles showing that he owned a company called UNESCO Holding Company in Washington Post, which was involved in the Iran-Contra arms deals through Poland with John Singleton, Richard Secord, Oliver North, George Bush. He built the bunkers, and he had a partnership set up with Kissinger and Associates to finance those. I'm presenting to you all the evidence on that. But he also was the chairman and executive director of a Yugoslavian bank in Montenegro known as Yugo Banka. He specialised in Swiss banking. Before he went back to Virginia, he told me he knew about the Promus software, as he knew that I was starting to expose things, and confirmed to me that it was presented to him by John Bond, the chairman of HSBC. I'm going to reveal to you the evidence that the Christic Institute investigation into geomilitary Militech consultants and also BCCI Nugenham Bank by the Christic Institute is independently verified by real evidence, and that both Danny CASOLARO and Daniel Sheehan were shut down by Department of Justice foxes, particularly Lawrence Barcella, who was working on the inside with other attorneys who had owned the secret counter-terrorism assassination team with the directors of WACKENHUT and Duane Claridge. I will go through and show you that Kissinger and Associates was involved with these transactions in Iraq and also involved with CIA Operation Still Point, and I'll show you that Nick's bank was used by Leo Wanta for laundering gold bullion to rebuild the Kuwait embassy, Kuwait Dina, with the ambassador to Kuwait in Spain, who then founded a company with Neil Bush. This is going to show you that independently, Daniel CASOLARO had the second smoking gun. He really did have the hard evidence that showed that the secret team not only was involved with the BCCI financing of Anna Khashoggi and Gorbanafar for the first TOW missiles, funded by the Kuwait royal family, but the second motive for killing him is that he had the hard evidence, as identified by Gene Wheaton and New York detective Jimmy Rothstein, who I've interviewed for over 15 years, confirming that Buck Revell from FBI had set up a secret counter-terrorism assassination team with WACKENHUT, Richard Secord and CIA operatives, and Danny CASOLARO held the smoking gun of legal evidence. And this is going to be presented to you now. The records show in the documents and diaries of Danny CASOLARO that he had telephoned Daniel Sheehan. And I've interviewed Daniel Sheehan, and he confirms that yes, he did have a telephone call and discussions with Danny CASOLARO prior to his death. And he certainly was extremely interested in the evidence that Daniel Sheehan had uncovered in his Christic Institute prosecution, which was also shut down by a corrupt justice system. You can only control a country when you control justice and the media. And this podcast will show how the octopus was controlling justice. The octopus was exposed in the FBI Operation Illwind, which was exposing fraud on a scale that the public has never seen, involving strategic Pentagon contracts involving bribes, investment deals of key officials within Pentagon who are in league with the octopus, and their connections in both the USA and also in Israel. And they were relating to the contracts for the Trident submarines, the AWACS, and also all the contracts relating to the war on drugs and terrorism under Vice President George Bush. They controlled everything and had infiltrated to ensure that their contracts and technology and software and databases is their proprietary technology based upon the Promus software that allows them to be the fox in charge of the henhouse. The evidence is overwhelming that Operation Illwind had exposed the octopus, and I believe without a doubt that this is going to prove that there was a second motive of the secret team to kill Danny CASOLARO. The people involved, as I'm putting the pieces together, was they had surrounded Danny CASOLARO with Joseph Queller, who was wanting to meet with Peter Wiedenix, who's intimately involved and linked with Alexander Haig and Earl Bryan for the customs contracts and management of the aerostat and radar systems used in partnership with Alan Bond, an Australian media baron who has won the contracts. And I'll do another podcast showing that the corrupt individuals in Pentagon who awarded the contract to Alan Bond had secretly bought shares in his company the week before and then sold them and made a killing. But more importantly, Richard Babian's affidavit confirms that Earl Bryan transferred $6 million across to Australia to Alan Bond for payment for the sale of the Promus software to the Australian government and the storage and safekeeping of tow missiles, C-130 planes, and other missiles technology being sold and transported through Western Australia for Iran and Iran-Contra. The key people who were threatened by Daniel CASOLARO was Frank CARLUCCI, who was the director of WACKENHUT, and also Sperry Group. And I'll prove to you that DUANE CLARRIDGE, Frank CARLUCCI, Lawrence Barcella had set up a secret CIA WACKENHUT counter-terrorism and assassination team. And the key person exposed in the fraud case, Operation Irwin, is Melvin Paisley. And I'm going to prove to you that Lawrence Barcella is intimately linked with Ted Shackley, Richard Pearl, Michael Ledeen, Alexander Haig, DUANE CLARRIDGE, Frank CARLUCCI, Earl Bryan, Bobby Inman, Oliver North, Richard Secord, Albert Hakem, and also John Singlaub. And let me prove it. This is the documents that Danny CASOLARO had, in addition to the first motive of killing the BCCI checks that never appeared at Senator Kerry's investigation of BCCI. Danny CASOLARO was highly focused on Frank CARLUCCI. He knew that Frank CARLUCCI was the person that an architect that set up the $4 billion Arab loans affair that brought down the Whitlam government in Australia in 1975. He was also linked to Nuganhan Bank and WACKENHUT with William Casey, and more importantly, intimately linked into Iran-Contra arms and drug sales with the secret team. He is a key player in the secret team. The other person that Danny CASOLARO was focusing on was DUANE CLARRIDGE. And this will prove to you that DUANE CLARRIDGE, after setting up CIA's counter-terrorism centre, was setting up his own private counter-terrorism centre and assassination team with the WACKENHUT directors. Intimately involved in everything. The Iran-Contra arms and drugs, and also the setup of the original Iran-Contra contracts with Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, and also Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanafar with Robert Sensi. And this is the person, Lawrence Barcella, who the secret team allowed them to control justice. In fact, I've interviewed William Hamilton, and he is shocked because he said, whilst Lawrence Barcella was acting as the assistant attorney for Department of Justice, he was intimately involved in the trials of the Promise software personally himself. So he's totally familiar with Bill Hamilton's and Inslaw's Promise software that has been modified at WACKENHUT for them to infiltrate all of the intelligence systems for the war on drugs and terrorism and the SWIFT banking software, so they can money launder their drugs through international banks and clearing houses. The key people involved with counter-terrorism consultants is with Frank CARLUCCI as the director of WACKENHUT and Sperry Group, Dr. Joseph Navarro, who is actually the president of WACKENHUT Advanced Technology Center, who was first contracted while working for strategic planning in 1979 and 1980 to evaluate Inslaw's Promise software for the Department of Justice and FBI. He's also involved with the complete war on drugs program, particularly with the aerostats and the radar systems that involve Earl Bryan's company Hadron Inc. and subsidiaries, together with Alan Bond with Airship Industries Inc. that won the contract and has the financial relationships directly with Earl Brian in Australia. Also involved was Dr. John Motley. He was Vice President of WACKENHUT Advanced Technology Centre, and if you recall, Michael Riconosciuto had testified that the Promus software was delivered to the WACKENHUT R&D Centre by Peter Wiedniks, who is managing the aerostat and radar tracking systems contracts awarded to Alan Bond's company and Hadron Inc. And now we'll prove that DUANE CLARRIDGE is the founder of this secret private counter-terrorism consultant group for assassinations. And Lawrence Barcella is also a founder of counter-terrorism consultants. The first evidence that definitively shows the motive for killing Danny CASOLARO was that he had the signed checks, the BCCI checks through the Monte Carlo accounts, that Robert Sensi has testified that he was working with Robert Gray, William Casey, and Clint Murchison, and William Wilson, who's ambassador to the Vatican, and that he was working with the Kuwait royal family in the embassy at Watergate Hotel, and also Kuwait Airlines based at Watergate Hotel, to bring the checks. And there were the transactions of the transfer of the checks, 1 million, 4 million, and also going up to 17 million for all other transactions through the Monte Carlo BCCI accounts. The copies of the signed 1 million check involving Gurbanifar and Khashoggi. Danny CASOLARO had copies of both checks. He also had the memos and transfers and letters of credit through the Monte Carlo, and this is the evidence that Senator Kerry's committee was demanding that Robert Altman hands across. He specified particularly the transactions with Adnan Khashoggi and Gurbanifar through BCCI's Monte Carlo account. This evidence was in the folders and research folders of Danny CASOLARO that had been removed from his house and were accessible to the FBI, Department of Justice, to prove that there was a motive. They ignored this evidence. This should have been on the front pages of the newspapers within weeks. And also, which Danny didn't have, is this confidential letter from William Weld, which is talking about the appropriate sent by Bradford Reynolds to William Weld on behalf of Edmund Meese, who was away. And I have an interview about this, and that shows that it involves Gurbanifar, Adnan Khashoggi. Richard Armitage will be the broker of the transaction of the software with Sheikh Khalid Mahfouz, who's the largest shareholder in BCCI, for the Promus software. And why is this unique? Because everyone talks about Promus software and they're talking about backdoor, but it needed a special data retrieval unit. No one's ever talked about that. Michael Riconosciuto and I understand that you need a special device. It's known as a Bragg cell channel analyzer, which allows it to intercept the emissions from computers that are going to be used under Echelon that cannot be detected. These emissions are hidden, they're orthogonal functions, they cannot be detected by ordinary means, and only known to NSA and CSS for the interception of all transmissions from the computer systems that are used by intelligence agencies, governments and banks worldwide. And this allows them to transfer funds and follow funds through the Swift banking network. The key person who's intimately involved is DUANE CLARRIDGE with Frank Carlucci, and he confirms in his book the close relationships he has with Michael Ledeen and Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig, and of course the brokering of the manager Gurbanifar transaction. The checks that Danny CASOLARO has for the original tow missiles around Contra deal, set up by Robert Sensi on behalf of CIA. Michael Ledeen clearly shows his relationship and support with Michael Ledeen, and the relationship between Ledeen and Shackley. setting up the War Games type training program, European Intelligence Service in Italy's intelligence service, while he's across there as the chief of the European division based in Italy, where everything's going down with P2 Lodge and banker Ambrosiano, and using the Vatican Bank for money laundering the drugs and arms through Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, together with CIA. He also talks about the intimate relationships they have for the sale of their arms to Iran through Israel. And this is very important because this Pentagon fraud case exposes the relationship between Ted Shackley, Frank Carlucci, Alexander Haig, and Hadron with Pentagon officials, with Israeli companies, for all of the fraud cases relating to all the transactions that involve Melvin Paisley and represented by Lawrence Barcella. And of course talks about, in his book, the Adnan Khashoggi interview and the 1 million and 4 million transaction. And you can't be any more specific than that Danny CASOLARO had the first, most damaging evidence that Senator Kerry's looking for in his briefcase, but he kept a copy in his research files. Michael has confirmed categorically to me, and I've done this in previous, that the first application for modifying the Proma software was for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines, which was important for the Trident submarine contracts, which involved Frank Carlucci's companies and also Earl Bryan's companies, Hadron Inc., together with Alexander Haig and Bobby Inman's companies, all exposed in the Pentagon fraud investigation. And it was integrated into the US Trident submarines, missile fire control and command systems. I'll do a complete podcast to show you that Frank Carlucci's companies, Hadron companies, had those contracts that were exposed in the fraud investigation. The second application, which is the main one for money laundering of all the drugs and arms by the OCTOPUS, is that the Proma software was modified so that it could infiltrate the SWIFT banking network, and I have a whole podcast series on doing that. And more important, I even prove that it was Rupert Murdoch's company that sold that modified software for SWIFT banking to the Australian government and Australian Federal Attorney General. It was renamed the Lean software and put into AUSTRAC, which is the equivalent of FinCEN in the USA. But he also confirms that it was put in at Citibank, and Dr. Earl Bryan and Hadron and CIA were using that at Citibank for moving all their covert funds around. I've proven in previous podcasts that they had infiltrated all of them by putting Lucia Conine into the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs originally, which became DEA, but more importantly it's in charge of the whole intelligence database and systems based at EPIC, which is the El Paso Intelligence Center, used by the Department of Justice. So the fox is in the hen house. Their man, together with the alliances with Robert Gray, together with Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson, across with EastCo, involving Richard Secord, Eric von Mabud and Michael Ledeen. So you cannot get any more specific than that, and Earl Bryan, and I've proven beyond doubt that their companies with Capucci and Associates, Operational Systems Inc., was the whole team was merged into Simcom Inc., a subsidiary of Earl Bryan's Hadron company. They developed all the software used by CIA for SWIFT banking. The previous podcast showed that the fox is in the hen house, the secret team with their appointment and ensuring that Bush Sr. is placed in charge as the Vice President for the war on drugs and terrorism. Their man is in charge to ensure that they can run the whole operations of selling drugs and arms worldwide. More importantly, with the Pentagon fraud case that's caught them out, it's not only the Trident submarine contracts with Frank Carlucci's company, the Sperry Group and Burroughs, but also Hadron Inc., but the key one that caught them out was the contract managed by Peter Wiedniks for the aerostat contracts and radar systems, command control systems that's put in at El Paso. And it is the central nerve center. It allows the OCTOPUS with WACKENHUT, FIDCO, EASTCO and the CIA CTC, Counter-Terrorism Center, infiltrating all intelligence on any drug operation worldwide that is sanctioned by a CIA in payment for all their arms that they're selling to dictators worldwide. Previous podcasts have shown WACKENHUT's relationship with the Cabazon Casino run by the Gambino Mafia, involving Robert Booth Nichols with arms companies, laundering all the drugs from Nugan Bank in Australia with arms and drugs through the subsidiaries of companies with Southern Goldfields, Jeffrey Stokes, who's also the Director of Mining Resources with Michael Hand and Frank Nugan. And also I have the proof of selling arms in Australia and involving Robert Booth Nichols directly. So the link between Nugan Bank, WACKENHUT, Gambino Mafia and CIA, Task Force 157 involved in bringing down the Whitlam government, and also Frank Carlucci spearheading with Ted Shackley, Michael Hand, Robert Booth Nichols to set up the $4 billion Arab loans affair in 1975. That was also confirmed in previous podcasts when I interviewed Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert V. Carone, who was known as CIA's bagman with the Gambino Mafia, and his intimate relationships with Michael Hand, Nugan Bank, and also confirmation when I interviewed Jimmy Rothstein, former New York detective, that during their investigations of US Customs investigation of Peter Wiedniks had purged himself during Michael Riconosciuto's trial, he confirms that Alexander Haig suddenly appears and shuts down the whole investigation into Peter Wiedniks, given his personal friendship and relationship with Peter Wiedniks. What's also very important to this whole podcast now, Jimmy Rothstein confirmed categorically to me in my interviews with him with over 15 years now. He said that Alexander Magnus and Jimmy Rothstein were speaking directly with Gene Wheaton, who confirmed that Oliver North and the FBI director, Oliver Buck Revell, were using Richard Secord, CIA operatives and WACKENHUT to set up their own secret counter-terrorism and assassination team. You can't make these things up. Jimmy Rothstein had never met Danny CASOLARO, and I'm going to prove to you that Danny CASOLARO had the evidence that that's true. He also confirmed that Alexander Magnus was also a friend of Oliver North, and he financed Jimmy Rothstein and Chuck Hayes to investigate proof that his International Aid Donation Foundation was being used by Oliver North and Tom Posse, linked to Iran-Contra arms and drugs and Ku Klux Klan, for illegal drugs and arms trafficking for the Nicaraguan Contras. You can't make this part up, and I'll show you why. More importantly, the most important thing is that it was Alexander Haig who intervened. And why is that important? Because when Robert Booth Nichols came to Australia and made threats against my life, at the end of telling me that I'm upsetting powerful Israeli businessmen, that he was linked to a restaurant called the Baron of Beith restaurant in Australia, in Victoria, linked to Nugan Bank, Mafia, CIA, he then tells me in his final sentence that all my troubles in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. That's after he approaches the TV station, the SBS, program exposing my true story about fraud being committed against me by the Johns Hopkins Institute. Given that they were my partners, but they were also involved in the development of the missile fire control systems for the Trident submarines with Hadron Inc. And they were the biggest client of Hadron Inc. This part's very important. Gene Wheaton confirms that Ted Shackley, Vernon Walters, Frank CARLUCCI, and Bing West, by the way, I've checked, it's not Ving West, it's Bing, B-I-N-G West. That text there has been interpreted from an interview with him, but it's not Ving, it's Bing. And he is intimately involved in this. That the group of these guys used to have a park bench meetings in the late 70s in McLean, Virginia, so nobody could overhear their conversations. And they basically said, with our expertise at placing dictators in power, why don't we treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over? And he says, and the first thing they had to do was get their man into White House, and that was George H.W. Bush. So this podcast will show you that they did take over the US, the whole justice system, in order to control governments. And he says here the first thing they did is they got George Bush, the Vice President's Task Force on Combating Terrorism. They made him the Vice President Task Force on Narcotics at the South Florida Task Force, so they could place people in DEA and in Pentagon and in Customs to run interference for them in these large-scale international narcotics and movement of narcotics money cases. And it also covers the selling of arms and deals and fraud exposed by Operation Ill Wind. And so now we're going to talk about the relationship. This will prove to you that Duane Claridge is a driver, and more importantly with WACKENHUT, with Frank CARLUCCI, Ted Shackley, but the relationship between these people is intimate. You've got George Bush Sr., Gerald Ford. As you know, he came to my rescue offering to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me for the fraud committed by Johns Hopkins. I believe that he only came forward because I'm exposing Project Hammer, CIA Operation Steel Point, and the Promise software. And it says here that the relationship was that Ted Shackley claimed that he would have become CIA director if President Gerald Ford had been re-elected in 1976. So there's the link between Ted Shackley and Gerald Ford. But more importantly, Lawrence Barcella, the key attorney who was involved in the trial of the Promise software while assistant attorney in the Department of Justice, he was also intimately involved in prosecuting Ed Wilson in order to shut down the evidence that implicated Ted Shackley and Richard Secord, even though he knew that Ted Shackley was intimately involved with Eastco. So now let's focus on the main process. This evidence is definitive that this is a second motive, in addition to the BCCI checks, for the secret team to murder Danny CASOLARO. He had the smoking gun of what Jimmy Rothstein knew and had stated was that Buck Revell, together with WACKENHUT and CIA, were setting up their own secret counter-terrorism and assassination team. And it was called Counter-Terrorism Consultants LP, registered in Washington. This should have been on the front pages of the newspaper following Danny CASOLARO's death with the BCCI checks. The key people, as I've already indicated to you, Frank CARLUCCI, Dr. John Motley, Duane Claridge, Lawrence Barcella, and it involves the AWAC aerostat radar contracts, and Dr. Joseph Navarro is the key person that Danny CASOLARO was chasing, that linked to Peter Wiednieks, who delivered the Promise software tapes to WACKENHUT Research Center for Michael Riconosciuto to modify, but also was managing the contracts that were awarded to Alan Bond and Earl Bryan's companies, Hadron and its subsidiaries. The key evidence is that WACKENHUT Hadron Inc. CIA theft of the install process software, premise software, and intimately linked the same octopus with the BCCI Swift banking laundering program with Capcom in Florida, laundering Noriega's drugs. And this part's really important because it's Lawrence Barcella. It's the same attorney. October surprise investigation. He's appointed to oversee that. WedTech Pentagon fraud case involving Ed Meese and a nephew of the Gambino Mafia. Iran-Contra Arms involving Richard Secord, John Singlaub. It's the Geo Militech Consultants Corp. It's one of the biggest cases of overwhelming evidence of selling arms through Poland for the Iran-Contra deal. He's appointed to represent them so they're not prosecuted. BCCI, Noriega Drugs and Capcom illegal case in Florida. I've done a podcast on that and shows you categorically the links of the Kuwait royal family and the Capcom importance for laundering the drugs and arms using CIA Operation Still Point and Project Hammer using the Promus software. Operation Illwind then touches on the US Trident submarines and missile fire control systems, AWACS airships with Alan Bond and Peter Wiedniks. Earl Bryan's Hadron, Universal Systems and T-Systems subsidiaries are involved with the contract. Frank Carlucci's company with WACKENHUT and Sperry Group. He's a common director at the same time with those, are involved in the contracts being awarded for the Trident submarines. Promus Software, WACKENHUT, Frank Carlucci, Earl Bryan, Peter Wiedniks, evidence, and WACKENHUT, the drug interdiction program contracts, involving Dr. Joseph Navarro sitting on the committee with CIA for the Aerostat radar interdiction programs. The Fox looking after the henhouse. So the key person who was identified is Melvin Paisley, convicted, involved in massive fraud, and intimately involved in buying shares in Alan Bond's company that was awarded the contract. Don't forget, Richard Babian independently confirms that he travels across to Australia, hands a cheque for $6 million. It's given through an Israeli Mossad agent to Alan Bond. And it's payment for the Promus software being sold to Australia and all the Iran-Contra arms and missiles and aircraft being refurbished from Vietnam being sold across for Iran-Contra operations. Lawrence Barcella is his appointed attorney, and this is what we discover. His targets were clearly in the handwriting: Frank Carlucci, Ted Shackley, Ray Klein, George Bush, and of course a couple of others in here. I'll talk about John Walker later on, but clearly Frank Carlucci. The intimate relationships of these people, Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Frank Carlucci, William Colby, and also Henry Kissinger, were linked back to the $4 billion Arab loans affair to bring down the Gough Whitlam government. So Frank Carlucci's at the top of Danny CASOLARO's investigations, and he believes he's got the smoking gun of the BCCI checks and linking and proving that. And he did that intimately in previous podcasts. I show you that's the motive for killing him. Ted Shackley felt threatened by Danny CASOLARO's. How do we prove that? It turns out that Ted Shackley is intimately involved in EastCo. He's intimately involved in the $4 billion Arab loans affair to bring down the Australian Whitlam government. But he's intimately involved in all of the drugs and arms deals for Iran-Contra. We know this because even the FBI investigation team actually has confirmed that Danny CASOLARO and George Pittaway met with Ted Shackley's girlfriend on July 4th. And they took her home and found her going through Danny's notes. Isn't that interesting? And also confirms that Danny has a new girlfriend called Wendy, and it turns out it's Wendy Golden, and they didn't contact her or interview her, yet they had her telephone numbers. And my prior podcast showed that she was invited to stay with the Crown Prince, Prime Minister of Kuwait, for the entire week that Danny CASOLARO is found dead. They whisked her away, and the evidence is overwhelming that the checks that Danny had with him were the greatest threat to him, but I'm going to prove it wasn't just that. It was all of the secret counter-terrorism and assassination teams set up by Frank CARLUCCI, DUANE CLARRIDGE, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, John Sinlow. So the evidence is overwhelming. Danny CASOLARO in his notes, handwriting, has circled all of the WACKENHUT annual reports relating to Frank CARLUCCI. As you can see, Frank CARLUCCI is appointed the Secretary of Defence 1987 to 1989. He also served on the NSC, National Security Advisor. He was also appointed the Deputy Secretary of Defence. So the OCTOPUS has their key man in Pentagon. From 1982 right through to 1989 in various roles, but while in between, he's actually the director of WACKENHUT and the Sperry Group, Burroughs Group, for the key Pentagon contracts for the Trident submarines, missile flight control systems, which is the first application of the PROMIS software. Prior to that, he'd served as the Deputy Director of CIA from 1978 to 1981. It appears that that's his reward while he was working as the Ambassador to Portugal, setting up the $4 billion Arab loans affair with Ted Shackley to bring down the Whitlam government. And here is the article from 1983 to 1986 confirming that he had been a director of WACKENHUT Corp. So that's very important, but he also was the director of the Sperry Group and Burroughs Group that won the contracts for the missile fire control systems for the Trident submarines, which is the key part for the story. But he's intimately involved in the Iran-Contra arms sales. And here is the evidence that his firm was under investigation during Operation Whirlwind. He's just being appointed as the new Secretary of Defence for Pentagon, and there's an investigation that's going to expose that his company, Sperry Group and Burroughs Group, which were merged into Unisys, had won the Trident submarine computer systems contracts, and it was done in partnership with Albit and Diagnostic Retrieval Systems, both from Israel. Albit was identified to be involved with the PROMIS software modifications required for Israel Mossad and military intelligence by Ari Ben-Menashe. So you have an intimate relationship here that is substantiated, is the first application of the PROMIS software, spearheaded by Frank CARLUCCI. And the key part here is after the investigation, Unisys agrees to pay $190 million for the fraud scandal. And the key person is Melvin Paisley, who's the key person from Pentagon, who is convicted, and during his conviction, he's being represented by Lawrence Barcella. Let's show you here, WACKENHUT's report. Danny CASOLARO has the report. This is in his research files. Key person here, Frank CARLUCCI. He's got George WACKENHUT and also Robert Chasen. Robert Chasen was responsible for the first aerostat trials in Florida. Isn't that interesting that they got the contracts for the aerostats and radar systems for tracking drugs, and on their board is Robert Chasen, who set up Fat Boy, the first aerostat balloon in Florida trials, a tethered balloon. And here is the evidence that Danny CASOLARO is chasing after, and it relates to Alan Bond's company, Airship Industries, together with Westinghouse, was awarded the contract managed by Peter Wiednieks, involving Hadron's companies. As you can see here, highlighting, here's the handwriting of Danny CASOLARO. He's interested in John Amaral, George WACKENHUT. He's talking about the links with CIA across. It's definitive that he's homing in on the fact that Robert Chasen was involved with ITT, which was involved in CIA operations in Chile. And he also sets up the aerostat contracts. But this is another document that Danny had in his research files. A report on terrorism group signed off by Frank CARLUCCI. Isn't this amazing that Danny's chasing after all of this? It's to do with terrorism, counter-terrorism, and Frank CARLUCCI. It has all the background information on Abu Nidal. 1 week before Danny's killed, the auditors of BCCI in London revealed that a cheque for $60 million was transferred across by the Kuwait embassy, payment to Abu Nidal. Abu Nidal was clearly a target with the links with the BCCI payments. And here's the handwriting of Danny CASOLARO confirming the BCCI cases, Abu Nidal and the Tampa, Florida 5 BCCI directors arrested involved with Noriega's and the Channel money. This is key evidence, and John Kerry. He had the BCCI checks, but he knew the payments. And guess who the attorney is that's representing BCCI? Lawrence Barcella. Here is the press release, $60 million transferred across to Abu Nidal, and it was transferred by the Kuwait embassy. He also is uncovering that WACKENHUT's responsible, and it says here, Pan Am World Airways. Danny CASOLARO knew about the Pan Am 103 bombing, and here is the evidence that they're responsible. WACKENHUT is providing all the security that allowed for the suitcase and bomb to be put onto the plane through Heathrow Airport. Don't you just love it that they're responsible for the security of Pan Am Airlines? Here is the photographs from the annual reports of WACKENHUT showing them setting up their own counter-terrorism training centre. Another photographs of their training operations. It's a private anti-terrorism crisis management division set up within WACKENHUT. Incredible. Highly specialised, includes TWC's Executive Protection Department, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, and US State Department. They're all experts being set up under WACKENHUT. This is to substantiate the testimony given to me in his interview, Jimmy Rothstein, former New York detective, who was investigating that Peter Wiednieks had purged himself. And the investigation was shut down by Alexander Haig. They also provide all the security for the nuclear sites. It says here, elite WACKENHUT security contingent, sophisticated weapons, helicopters, armoured vehicles. We're talking about a private army here. WACKENHUT Advanced Technology Corporation, WATCO. And this is the key part, is that it's involved with the war on drugs program. So Danny CASOLARO was homing in on the overwhelming evidence. Here's where he's highlighted Dr. Joseph Navarro. It's a handwriting of Danny CASOLARO. He's got a telephone number where he's calling, and it's the Applied Research Centre. Clearly, Danny CASOLARO knew that they were involved with the Aerostat radar tracking system contracts managed by Peter Wiedniks, and I can prove that to you. Previous podcasts show that WACKENHUT was contracted to provide the airport security for all the screening of luggage, Heathrow Airport, Pan Am Flight 103, when the McKee team was returning to the USA with evidence that Ted Shackley's secret team were involved in the illegal drugs and arms trafficking. I've also shown the intimate relationships of WACKENHUT providing security for Ishram Barbuti, given the evidence that the bomb and the suitcase with clothing was purchased at the building adjacent to the office of Ishram Barbuti in Malta. It also shows the links with Carlos Ghosn. You've got Frank Carlucci as a director, and it links back with his relationships with Ted Shackley, John Singlaub, Pat Robertson's company, who employed Lester Coleman, intimately involved in Capcom, money laundering of Noriega's drugs in the BCCI reports. But this part, Overseas Press Services, was revealed to be involving Singlaub and Secord, and C4 explosives are found located in the US at their building. Fitco, with George Pender, Robert Mayhew and Clint Murchison, who employed Robert Sensi, involved in the BCCI checks, and also with CIA assassination teams down in Angola. And of course, Duane Claridge, Vincent Canestraro, with the CIA Counter-Terrorism Center, intimately involved in investigations of the bombing of Pan Am 103. It's the fox looking after the chicken coop. The secret team, together with Robert Gray, has everything stitched up with BCCI, Banca Ambrosiana, Guggenheim Bank and Citibank with the Promise software for Swift banking. They had infiltrated everything on intelligence, on drugs, terrorism and banking. But you need to control the justice system if you're going to run a country. And so now that the Fox is in there, they've got all the intelligence software. The teams that developed it are their teams. It goes back to the company set up by Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, ISCO, and the secret, safe Iris Swift banking software. I've proven beyond doubts that that software was sold to Australia by Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group. It involved a partnership with Wang Labs and Hadron Inc. And this is now the key part that I'd like to focus on. Danny CASOLARO knows Lawrence Barcella is the key attorney appointed to shut down all investigations, BCCI, Iran-Contra, October Surprise, the assassination of leaders worldwide, Chile, Argentina, Italy, involving the secret team. And clearly in it is Frank Carlucci, Ed Wilson, Eric von Marbod, Albert Hakim, Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Richard Secord, and Michael Ledeen. It has ticks in all boxes. Danny CASOLARO knows that this is the secret team members, a shadow government, a shadow network being set up. And Frank Carlucci is a director of WACKENHUT, intimately linked to the evidence given by Michael Riconosciuto with the Promise software, and links with Guggenheim Bank in Australia and the dismissal of the Gough Whitlam government with the $4 billion Arab loans affair. So let's now focus on counter-terrorism and the resume. Duane Claridge is the key founder with Frank Carlucci at WACKENHUT. Lawrence Barcella, key lawyer, shutting down all evidence so that the octopus can control justice. Let's go to it. Here's the main resume. The key person says that they're an associate, but it didn't put their name. In this prospectus, the name is the only one missing on this, but this is the key person. And it's a senior level CIA operations officer. Planning strategies for governments to deter and respond to terrorism, as well as establishment and maintenance of the intelligence databases drawn from technical human resources and including specific techniques of collection. In addition, specialising liaison with national and international intelligence, law enforcement, diplomatic and military communities. Previously, he was the chief of counter-terrorism for CIA. He managed the United States' first special intelligence team reactions to terrorist incidents overseas. Until his retirement from Central Intelligence, he has returned from abroad in 1987. He represented CIA's overseas on international planning bodies connected with NATO organisations. Previously, he was the chief of counter-terrorism of CIA. Principal CIA counter-terrorism representative on White House, State Department, National Security Committee charged with combating terrorism. He was the chief of a CIA facility in Europe. It's Italy. Deputy in charge of CIA element responsible for paramilitary activities worldwide. Directed air, maritime, ground power paramilitary activities. He was the chief of the CIA air and maritime elements 74 to 77. That is the resume of Duane Claridge. Next person, Dr. James Motley. He served government and he was also a director of WACKENHUT's Research Centre. He was also Vice President's Task Force on Combating Terrorism. He appeared before it. A director of WACKENHUT. L. Carter Cornick Jr., former director of FBI Counter-Terrorism Computer Center. We're talking about the Octopus has access to all intelligence databases of CIA, FBI, a private counter-terrorism and assassination team. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI's Counter-Terrorism Computer Center. Then he leads the investigations into the assassination of Orlando Letelier, the Chilean ambassador to the United States. He investigates the 1983 bombings of the American Embassy and the US Marine Corps compound in Beirut, Lebanon. This is where the McKee team was. And 1984 seizure of American hostages in Lebanon. In 1985, he was active on the management support of FBI investigation into the TWA flight, 847 hijacking, and the Achille Laura shipping hijacking and murder case. This is controlling justice. Eugene Proper was assistant US attorney in Washington, D.C., 72 to 79. This is while Inslaw's doing its beginning of its PROMIS software trials with the Department of Justice. Criminal Division of Department of Justice. He investigated the assassinated Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier and successful prosecution of Ed Wilson and Frank Turple for selling weapons to Libya. These are the people that Ed Wilson believes had shut him down in order to protect Ted Shackley, Richard Secord from prosecutions over EastCo. Then we have Frank McNeil. He was the ambassador to Costa Rica, US State Department, also based in Madrid. Then we have Mayor Nadal, worked with US Department of State, Nicaragua and El Salvador. I mean, this is a private counterterrorism company set up in Washington. State Department Counterterrorism Emergency Planning, unbelievable. This is private. And now the key person with Duane Claridge is Lawrence Barcella. And I'm highlighting this, that he's been the liaison with my country, Australia, with all their investigations of drugs, arms, involving Ed Wilson, Robert Booth Nichols, Nuganhan Bank, the Mafia, relating to all evidence the CIA was involved in all this, which was quashed. This is the fox looking after the chicken coop. They control justice. He also was involved in the investigation of the bombing of TW flight. Wilson terrorism. It's him that set this all up to entice Ed Wilson to come back through Dominican Republic to be arrested and charged and put in prison, and denying that he ever worked with CIA. He also was Deputy Chief of Major Crimes Division, U.S. Attorney Office for the District of Columbia. Bill Hamilton has confirmed that he was in shock when I mentioned Lawrence Barcella, because he was intimately involved and Bill was dealing with him with the trials of the Promus software whilst he was working as the Deputy Chief of the Major Crimes Division for the U.S. Attorney's Office in District of Columbia. Intimately linked to Promus. It says here that he's also running a law firm with Senator Laxalt. And Senator Laxalt, Michael Riconosciuto testified, was involved in the transfer of the $40 million involving Ferdinand Marcos for October Surprise. And have a look at this. When you go to the Wikipedia page, not only was he responsible for the prosecutions of Ed Wilson, but he was also involved to give the go-ahead and signing off of documents for the Iran-Contra related weapons shipments. 5 million shipment of Soviet block rifles, machine guns and granted to Nicaragua Contras. And this is the deal through Poland. 10 months Congress with Richard Secord and John Singlaub through Geomilitech Consultants. And this is a key case. He also was the attorney representing the BCCI directors, 5 of them that were exposed in the money laundering with Capcom. He then, not only that, was appointed to represent Lynn Nofsinger for WedTech involving Ed Meese and the nephew of the Gambino Mafia. He was then appointed to represent Melvin Paisley for the complete Operation Irwin that exposes the octopus. And this one, he also was appointed as the attorney to represent Jose Blandon, who was going to testify about Noriega's drugs going through BCCI in Florida, and declines to give testimony to Senator Kerry's committee. And last of all, appointed to represent the investigation for White House into the October Surprise Task Force involving Paul Laxalt, with the delivery of the $40 million check involving William Casey, Ed Meese, Robert Gray. This is unbelievable. Danny CASOLARO was a threat to the octopus. He had this secret document and relationship supported by the testimony of Gene Wheaton and Jimmy Rothstein independently, that Buck Revell was using WACKENHUT and CIA operatives with Richard Secord to set up a private, secret counter-terrorism and assassination team. Justice, when you control justice, you control the company. Their man was Lawrence Barcella. They've infiltrated all intelligence databases, CIA, FBI, DEA. And their man, Vice President George Bush at the time, was in charge of the war on drugs and terrorism. They were shipping drugs and arms immune from prosecutions. I've proven in all my podcasts of the relationship between them all to the Swift banking software developed by their companies, Earl Bryan's company, Wang Labs, and Rupert Murdoch's company, for covert Swift banking. I also exposed Operational Systems Inc., owned by Ed Wilson, linked to Eastco, involve Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Joseph Capucci, Paul Wormley, and Thomas Caster, the key people involved in the Inslaw case, working for Hadron, that stole Inslaw's software. Delivered by Peter Wiedniks to the WACKENHUT Research Centre for the Secret Team to modify it for Trident submarines, to track Soviet missiles and submarines, and also the Swift banking. The key motive for killing Danny CASOLARO was that he was gathering too much evidence on the secret team, including WACKENHUT, Hadron Inc., and Ted Shackley's secret team. The OCTOPUS was involved with everything: the theft of Inslaw's Promus software, involved in the money laundering of arms and drugs and gold bullion through BCCI, and also the Pentagon fraud contracts that were exposing the OCTOPUS in a major operation by FBI to expose, in Operation Ill Wind, all of the companies in bribes, kickbacks, and secret alliances to monopolize and win all defense contracts with WACKENHUT and with Ted Shackley's companies, and Hadron Inc., and Peter Wiedniks' key role in ensuring that those contracts are managed and organised and awarded with Pentagon officials, with secret bank accounts with them, for the war on drugs and terrorism, so they maintain control of all intelligence databases relating to any investigation that will expose their illegal exports of arms, the trafficking of drugs for payment for those arms from all the dictators in the countries worldwide that they're empowering to stay in power, and also for the payment of gold bullion by corrupt governments in order to pay for those weapons, and also money launder the drugs. The key second motive for killing Danny CASOLARO is that he had discovered the secret prospectus document and resumes that exposed DUANE, CLARRIDGE, the directors of WACKENHUT, and the former US attorney Lawrence Barcella, who the secret team keeps reappointing with their links into White House, to be in charge of all investigations that would expose them, and surprising, no one's charged, evidence is not revealed, and this undermines all of the credible efforts of research done by Danny CASOLARO, but also confirms the OCTOPUS had undermined the legitimate investigations by Daniel Sheehan and the Christic Institute to achieve prosecutions against the leading members of the secret team who are involved in illegal arms and drugs trafficking. He was undermined by Lawrence Barcella and his links into justice. And as I say, you can only control a country when you control justice and the media, and they were controlling justice. As you can see, he's appointed to oversee the October surprise investigation, a conflict of interest as he works for Senator Laxalt. More important, he's intimately linked to everything relating to Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson's companies, and Hadron's companies and Frank Carlucci's companies involved in October Surprise with William Casey, Robert Gray, key people behind the October Surprise investigation. He's also overseeing WedTech, the Pentagon fraud case, exposing White House officials linked to the nephew of the mafia, the Gambino mafia, in major Pentagon fraud case. He then oversees and protects Richard Secord and Jong Sin-Lao, who are involved intimately in the Iran-Contra arms deals involving their company Militech Consultants. Also representing the BCCI directors, the 5 of them, who are involved in the money laundering of Norwegia's drugs through Capcom, through the Chicago Exchange, Futures Exchange. Operation Illwind, involving all their companies. Each of them are involved in all aspects of the key investigations of the Inslaw software and the BCCI money laundering operations. And that made Danny CASOLARO an immediate threat to the secret team. This is the second motive. No one has ever seen this prospectus before on the Counter-Terrorism Consultants, company set up by CIA operatives and WACKENHUT officials with Lawrence Barcella. Daniel Sheehan was contacted by Danny CASOLARO by telephone. They talked for many hours about his investigations with the Christic Institute and the evidence that he held involving the secret team's involvement in Iran-Contra arms and also trafficking of drugs into the USA and also into Australia with the Nugan Hand Bank. When we look at the evidence that Daniel Sheehan had exposed, I'm going to show you that the evidence that I independently uncovered in my exposure of the Promus software in Australia that Danny CASOLARO was investigating is directly complementing and supporting the independent evidence of Daniel Sheehan and the evidence of Danny CASOLARO. If you have a look at the Christic Institute's legal case, it's covering evidence, overwhelming evidence that the secret team had set up an enterprise for trafficking opium, heroin, cocaine. It was money laundering the drugs through Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. The cover-up of the evidence of Nugan Hand Bank was overwhelming evidence that they controlled justice. And I uncovered in all of the correspondence with the Royal Commission and the Royal Commission writing and visiting the FBI, seeking and demanding evidence and records that show that FBI has evidence of CIA links with Nugan Hand Bank. The report that they received, almost every page is blacked out, redacted. The names of everyone, including Michael Hand. And why would they be redacting the name of Michael Hand? And it confirms that he was working with CIA. And the most important thing is, who's the person who's redacting the entire report and overseeing it? And I have the overwhelming evidence in the communications with the Royal Commissioner in their investigations. It's with the FBI Counter-Terrorism group that's overseeing the cover-up of the evidence with letters and correspondence from Oliver Buck Revell. And in my interviews with Jimmy Rothstein, former New York detective investigating the overwhelming evidence that Peter Wiedniks had purged himself in Michael Riconosciuto's trial, where he testifies that he has links with Nugenhan Bank. Michael Hand testifies that he is asked to and requested to modify the Promise software tapes that were delivered to WACKENHUT Research Centre by Peter Wiedniks. Confirms that in his discussions direct with Gene Wheaton that Oliver Buck Revell, the director of FBI's counter-terrorism group, is working with WACKENHUT and CIA operatives to set up their own secret counter-terrorism and assassination team. And this is overwhelming evidence that supports the Christic Institute's legal case and evidence that was shut down despite the independent evidence. So Nugenhan Bank. Danny CASOLARO was following the money laundering records of WACKENHUT Research Centre together with the Cabazon Arms companies, known as Armtech, set up by Peter Zakowski, with Meridian Arms with Robert Booth Nichols, links with the Gambino Mafia, were money laundering the drugs through the casinos, Cabazon Casino, and also with Michael Hand with the Nugenhan Bank. And independently, I have verified in previous podcasts that Michael owned a company called Recovery Technologies with Paul Maraska, who was murdered, given his knowledge on and involvement as the banker, assisting Michael Hand to launder gold bullion from Nugenhan Bank through the Cabazon Arms and with drugs with the Gambino Mafia. I proved that they were doing it with Southern Goldfields, owned by Peter Briggs, who was charged and convicted during the Royal Commission known as the Costigan Inquiry into the evidence that the painters and dockers, together with CIA and Nugenhan Bank, were money laundering the weapons and drugs that were being brought into the country through the shipping companies and airlines. More important, the link with the Gambino Mafia, Representative Donald Lockyer, who was involved in over 600 companies used as front companies for the money laundering, with Peter Briggs's finance company, and the chairman and director of Southern Goldfields was Jeffrey Stokes, who happens to be the same director and chairman of Mining Resources with the directors Michael Hand and Frank Nugan, who owned a gold mining company in Western Australia. And of course it was linked across to Armtech Limited, set up with Armtech from WACKENHUT, and evidence overwhelming that Robert Booth Nichols was directly involved with the demonstration of new guns with night scopes being used for counter-terrorism, sold to the Australian counter-terrorism group with SAS and also with the military in Australia. And he had contracts with the Kuwait government, the Philippines government and the Thai governments. And this was exposed to have links with the mafia. So there's overwhelming evidence that supports the Nugenhan Bank transactions that Danny CASOLARO was following, and he was aiming to go and visit WACKENHUT and the Cabazon and then come to Australia to meet with the Royal Commissioners of the Nugenhan Bank Royal Commission and the Costigan Inquiry. Also independently, Daniel Sheehan was looking at the links of the World Anti-Communist League set up by John Singlaub, and the links with counter-terrorism and rescue of kidnapped hostages in Lebanon. Also, talking quite extensively is the overwhelming links of NSC together with the Iran-Contras with Singlaub, and also Singlaub supplies weapons and explosives through geomilitech. And this becomes very important. The links of his evidence were following terrorism, hostages in Lebanon, the transactions of Shackley with Gorbanafar, with the BCCI checks that Danny CASOLARO had, signed by Gorbanafar and Adnan Khashoggi. The key evidence that was the first motive for killing Danny CASOLARO, he held them. And it was withheld from the Senator Kerry's inquiry, and the demand by Senator Kerry that Robert Altman, the attorney representing BCCI, would hand those transactions across. And independently, we have the testimony of William Turner that Danny CASOLARO was travelling down to Martinsburg and was meeting with Robert Altman, who was reluctantly agreeing to meet with him because Danny CASOLARO was threatening to give those signed checks and Monte Carlo bank transaction records to the BCCI inquiry. That was the first motive for having Danny CASOLARO murdered. But the records of the TOW missile sales linked Ted Shackley directly to this. Here is the first evidence, just to remind you, the signed checks. And Danny CASOLARO, I could not find that he had copies of this, but this is what William Hamilton provided me in 2006. A copy of a letter transcribed involving a letter from Bradford Reynolds across to William Weld. And it is confirming the Promus software with a special data retrieval unit. That is key evidence that I have substantiated in previous podcasts. No one knew that you needed this special data retrieval unit, which is technology that allows for Echelon to intercept the communications of all computers undetected for banks and for computer systems with the Promus software sold to foreign intelligence agencies such as ASIO and ASIS in Australia, or the UK, MI5, MI6, Canadian CSIS and CSE, who may reluctantly not share all of their intelligence with America, but they can see and intercept exactly what they're holding and what they're looking at any time. So the key evidence here is critical. Danny CASOLARO is following the arms deals and Lawrence Barcella. He's starting to investigate Lawrence Barcella. And this part's very important. The Singlaub geomilitech arms sales, and also the FDN funds by North and Owen, who works for Robert Gray. And this becomes critical to all the records of who was involved with the Promus software, who's involved with the secret team, who is involved in the selling of arms and drugs in the Iran-Contra. And all my previous records show that we track it down to Richard Secord and John Singlaub in Lebanon, and linked back to the bombing of Pan Am 103 to kill the McKee team, who are returning with all the overwhelming evidence of the secret team is involved in trafficking drugs, using airlines to fly it in with the Gambino Mafia. This is the press release confirming in 1987 the exposure of geomilitech and set up with Barbara Studley and John Singlaub, and of course a bank manager at a Florida bank who approves all of the funding of those transactions. And it's for the sale of arms from Poland to the Iran-Contra. It shows the links of the transactions taking place right through to the sale of the AK-47s that are purchased through the Polish military as a transaction with John Singlaub and Richard Secord. The directors and key advisors of Geomilitech Consultants Corporation confirms that it was the Iran-Contra deal, and it involves partnership in arms with Israel and North Korea. And this is critical because Lawrence Barcella is representing the Pentagon fraud case that exposes all the companies of the OCTOPUS. And the evidence that I will show you in the next parts of this podcast will clearly show you there are bank accounts in Switzerland with Assistant Secretary of Naval Research and Development awarding all the contracts for the Trident submarines, the AWACS and the Aerostat radar tracking systems for the war on drugs and terrorism, hold with Israel military companies and generals. Most important, the staff members, Barbara Studley, just a talk show host, suddenly running a military company. I've uncovered all her records that she's meeting with a Jewish, Orthodox Jewish Foundation in Florida as a guest speaker, and clearly her links are with John Singelal and Richard Secord through this company directly with the Israelis. And if you have a look at the other people, Ron S. Harrell is the Israeli Air Force veteran, is running the office in Israel. Also it has General Robert Schweitzer, who's part of NSC. Bruce E. Herbert, a former US Navy captain. Joel Arnon, former Assistant Director General in Israeli Ministry and Foreign Affairs. I have his speeches and meetings with former President Gerald Ford, and intimately involved in the relationships with the Ford administration, with Ted Shackley, and with EastCo, and together with the deals in Israel and Libya. Lieutenant General Daniel O'Graham. Now this is a key part, former director, deputy director of CIA, but also director of DIA. And this one, John Carbauer, a member of Le Circle. Please watch my podcast on Le Circle, the 6 Eye, and its links with Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, and also with Vernon Walters, former Deputy Director of CIA, and Michael Hand, and their links with P2 Lodge and banker Ambrosiana for the money laundering, and also through the Vatican Bank. This is the octopus. This is the case that Daniel Sheehan was exposing, and I'm going to show you that this is key because Lawrence Barcella was mysteriously then appointed to represent their disaster when they're exposed in selling legally selling arms from Poland across to Iran-Contra. This is a reminder of my podcast relating to all parts of Le Circle, the 6 Eye. And as you can see, Vernon Walters, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, and Alexander Haig with Henry Kissinger, and of course billionaire David Rockefeller and Zabinski. They're tied up with the founders of the Vatican Bank and banker Ambrosiano for the money laundering of all the drugs and arms with the P2 Lodge. You can't make this stuff up. Their member is one of the members of Le Circle with Ted Shackley. So let's have a look at Daniel O'Graham, Office of National Estimates, Director and Collections of the DIA, Deputy Director of CIA from 73 to 74 under William Colby during the dismissal of the Whitlam government. He was the Deputy Director of CIA, working with Ted Shackley, William Colby, and crossing over with Nugan Bank. Then he's appointed as the military advisor to Ronald Reagan for 1976 for his first run, and then 1980 campaign, which overlaps with October Surprise. But he's the father of SDI, Strategic Defence Initiative. He has set up the High Frontier Inc., a private organisation that's promoting kinetic energy weapons approach to space-based defence, and then he is leading President Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet, and he also becomes a member of the American Freedom Coalition and the US Council for World Freedom set up by the Unification Church, CAUSA USA. And there's the overlap with John Singlaub. But this part, he's the father of SDI. Here's his links with Halonetics with Robert Gray. William Simon, who's sitting on the board of Citibank, where the Promus software has been put in for Project Hammer. Robert Gray, intimately involved with EastCo with Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Eric von Barbord, Thomas Kleins and Michael Ledeen. Previous podcasts showed that the former chairman, Chuck Missler, became so disgusted with what he felt was evil, power, corruption, almost like a cult, becomes a preacher and preaches against and denounces what America is doing worldwide. And of course, the investor behind it is Bernard Katz, who was the investor with Exonics with Earl Bryan. And Chuck Missler not only is the chairman and CEO of Halonetics, which is looking at using lasers and to bring down Soviet nuclear missiles, the SDI program, but it also, he worked as a director directly with Earl Bryan on Hadron Inc. and is aware of what Hadron Inc.'s doing, Halonetics. So he's preaching about the evils of a power, a secret power, linked to Masonic groups and also with cults, and undermining the currencies worldwide, the money laundering, the movement of drugs and arms. He knew what was going on in the name of national security. It's the octopus. So we have the direct links of key generals and representatives from Israeli intelligence, CIA, John Singlaub, Richard Secord, selling arms with collaboration to Iran through Israel and North Korea, but also selling the guns. Now I'm going to show you something now that I've never told anyone before. In 2001, after being destroyed by John Hopkins a second time, and meeting the architect of Echelon at the John Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Bruce McIndoe, who was in charge, and his company was involved with Hadron Inc., representing NSA, Echelon, developed the Trident submarine missile fire control systems with Hadron Inc., and also with the Sperry Group and Burroughs Group, headed by Ted Shackley. They're the people that destroyed me in 2001 a second time. Previous podcasts show that. But this is who came to my rescue. I was introduced to a banker from Yugoslavia, from Serbia-Herzegovina, who was living in Australia, and I had presented the encryption technologies used with WiseKey over in Geneva. I was asked to do the presentation. I met them, and several weeks later, I'm destroyed by John Hopkins. All my contracts are destroyed, and he came to my rescue and invited me to come and work for him. And I only have good things to say about him because he did rescue my family and he was good to me. And over 2 years, after working and trying to help him set up telemedicine and science and research projects in Serbia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and the Balkans, and several other countries throughout Asia where he had partnerships, he shared with me his story. and he worked with Yugoslavian military intelligence. I uncovered from the official records of Yugoslavia that the State Security Service of the former Federation of Yugoslavia, Nick was the first counter-intelligence administration official who headed the second sector of immigration and was considered their expert on US Central Intelligence Agency. He also was the chairman and executive director of AMCO Group, including AMCO Montenegro and its group of companies that control 51% of the Yugo Bank. And throughout the 2 years, he shared with me all the transactions that Yugo Bank was doing throughout Europe. But this is what I uncovered. He also told me and confirmed many times, he showed me a Quran, he was a devout Muslim, that was signed personally by Colonel Gaddafi. And he confirmed to me many times that he was a personal advisor working in Libya for Colonel Gaddafi, with his family living in Libya for many years, and also his companies were then contracted to build all the military bunkers in Iraq for Saddam Hussein's Air Force and also for the military, and told me many stories about the difficulty of building it, where it's almost the bunkers are floating on oil under the sand. He also advised that several years ago, many years ago, he was approached at a hotel in London by George H.W. Bush Sr. and requested to personally move across to Virginia with his companies and family and work with him to assist CIA to identify the location of all the secret military bunkers that he built for Saddam Hussein prior to Operation Desert Storm, after the Iraqi forces who had invaded neighbouring Kuwait. And this you're going to find amazing. So this evidence is new to complement the credibility of what Daniel CASOLARO was investigating. This is coming from Australia, and Danny CASOLARO was planning to come to Australia to finish his book and research on the Proma software being sold to Australia, Nugan Bank money laundering of drugs, arms, links back to Cabazon and WACKENHUT with Robert Booth Nichols and Dr. John Philip Nichols, and also the BCCI transactions relating to Nugan Bank. So I'm going to show you the independent evidence. I worked for his company called AMCO Group, and here is a copy of the website that I still hold in all the records. And as you can see, his company was building military bunkers across Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile and Bolivia, including Iraq and Libya. And this part's very important because the evidence of what the Octopus was doing in Argentina with death squads being set up with the secret team, and also across in Chile and Bolivia, is critical. And here are the press releases that I did not know until many years ago. I did further searches and found the papers. This was in the Washington Post story back in 1994, and remember, I'm working for him in 2001 through to 2002 for 2 years. 2003 actually. And here's an article: Polish sales of latest Soviet military equipment to the Americans worth $150 to $200 million throughout the 1980s. And it was involving a Polish organisation set up in the Republic of South Africa and representatives of the Polish community that were part of the deal, and it involved ED and BL engaged in arms trade. It says ED died last year, so they're using letters, but BL visited Poland in January 1991. He was particularly interested in the Polish defence industry, and particularly the Swidnik helicopter factory, the Mesko plant in Trzaskowsko, Karina, posing as a representative of a non-existent firm called UNESCO Europe Holding Co. for Eastern countries. Then, as a representative of Kentron Company, he attended a demonstration of helicopters, aircraft identification systems, offered to arrange cooperation with South Africa industry. And it says here that BL, and I don't know who BL is, was accompanied by arms trader Nikola Banisevic, a Republic of South Africa citizen who immigrated from Yugoslavia, who probably engaged in smuggling arms to the Middle East, including Iraq. He was chased by the authorities of Bolivia, Chile and Nigeria for various offences, especially fraud. I have nothing but good things to say about Nick Banisevic, his wife, who looked after myself and my family after being destroyed by the Johns Hopkins institutions. He was good to me, he wanted to do good things, and I assisted him to identify science and research opportunities for Kosovo, and also for Serbia, and also for Croatia and other Balkan countries in healthcare and in advanced technologies and research and policy. He respected me and said I was the most honest person he's ever met. I believe he protected me from George Bush Sr., Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, and eventually that's when Robert Booth Nichols comes to Australia to threaten me, given I'm exposing my knowledge about the Promus software used for Swift banking and communicating directly with Bill Hamilton and also with Michael Riconosciuto during the middle of exposing the fraud committed by the Johns Hopkins institutions, who are intimately involved in the use of the Promus software for the Trident submarines and Echelon. It goes on to say that state-of-the-art air defence systems built by the Soviet Union, a shipment is arranged in the 1980s, coordinated by the CIA, acquisition of advanced Soviet weapons from the Warsaw Pact countries. Nick Banisevic had access to key military people in the Soviet Union and also in Poland and also in South Africa. I know that for a fact. I know that from his prospectuses and company annual reports that I hold, but more important, the many discussions he shared with me what he had done in the past. And it clearly is confirming that Nick is involved directly with Geomilitech and CIA. And I know that for a fact because I'm going to show you more. I've never shown anyone this before. Here is the prospectus and registration of UNESCO Chemical Company that was set up by Nick in South Africa. The date 1990, and it was owned by him and his wife. He had over 30 companies that I know, and I've got the details on, in Virginia and America that he set up, and also in Germany, and also in Panama and Yugoslavia. And this is very important. He has business experience. He was trained at the Military Academy Counterintelligence. This is in his resume for his companies that I have copies of. He worked in Yugoslavian intelligence service for over 24 years, major position handling strategy for the Middle East and Africa. The State Security Service of Yugoslavia at the time said that he was in charge of first counterintelligence administration, who headed the second, and I've just sent you that, but he was considered in the record of Yugoslavian intelligence that I have a copy of. I downloaded it, got it from Yugoslavia, confirms that he was considered their top expert on US Central Intelligence Agency. And this is the part that's important. He was the chairman executive director of AMCO Montenegro and its group of companies, and he owned 51% of a bank called Banka, registered in Yugoslavia and Montenegro, and it was considered the 14th largest bank in Europe with approximately $3.27 billion in US dollar assets. His expertise was in Swiss banking, hence Promus. After his death, he died in Virginia. He returned from Australia back to Virginia and he passed away. His wife died while she was in Australia while I was there. But he returned, I lost contact with him and he went back to Virginia and he's passed away now. But I found this. This is the official records of Leo Wanta. He confirms categorically that his company had an alliance with Banka, Yugoslavia, and Nick was the chairman and executive director. It was used for transferring gold bullion to restabilize the Kuwait dinar after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. You can't make these things up. Here is a copy of the record for CIA Operation Stillpoint, confirming that there was 200 billion dinars being moved through Nick's bank to assist the ambassador of Kuwait to rebuild the dinar currency using the Promus software. In a conversation with Nick before he left in Australia in 2004, he told me he saw the TV program that I'm exposing on John Hopkins and knew I was being destroyed, and I asked him about Promus software before he left Australia. He said that he has seen the Promus software. It was presented and demonstrated to him by John Bond, the chairman of HSBC Bank for Swiss banking. Nick's expertise was in Swiss banking for the whole of the Balkans. Links into Russia, Iraq and Libya and many countries throughout South America and Middle East. And so this is the key part. And so here we have, it's going through not only his bank, but it's also going through a Bank of China with Leo Wanta's company. And this is why Robert Booth Nichols turned up to threaten me as well. Not only am I speaking directly to Michael Riconosciuto in prison about the Promus software, Nugenham Bank and everything that he did in Australia, but I have the legal proof that the company set up by Leo Wanta in London is the same address as Herbert Bost, who is the business partner of Robert Booth Nichols, and I have the court testimony of Robert Booth Nichols when money laundering $250 billion US security note using the Promus software, is meeting with the directors of Citibank, and also confirms in his testimony to FBI that his business partner is Herbert Bost, who is the personal friend of Ferdinand Marcos. And he manages over $1 billion of gold bullion in secret Swiss accounts in Geneva, Switzerland, where Robert Booth Nichols reportedly mysteriously dies in 2009. Here is the statements again of Leo Wanta, confirming that he was working directly for President Reagan and he was working out of the office of the Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos. And after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Wanta used his expertise to help re-establish the value of the Kuwait currency, and he received a letter of thanks from the Kuwait royal family and ambassador. Here is his statement: the Kuwait Dina Forex is sanctioned by the US government programs utilising Insular's Promus software for restabilising it. So this is independent proof. Nick's bank involved in, and companies are involved in the arms being brought by John Singlaub, Richard Secord, Ted Shackley for the Iran-Contra, and his bank's been used with Leo Wanta with CIA Operation Still Point for the money laundering of all gold bullion, drugs and arms for Iran-Contra using the Promus software. And here is the letter of thanks to Leo Wanta from the ambassador of Kuwait in Spain. And this is a very important letter, thanking him for helping re-establish the Kuwait Dina, and it uses Nick's bank. You can't make this up. What's important is, how did I find CIA Operation Still Point and find that evidence? I was destroyed by a bogus prince, the first time, who was offering to make a $1 billion donation to our United Nations SEAL trade program that I had set up with Carlos Pereira, head of the United Nations Trade Development Centre and SEAL program, and I had brought in my links with the Australian federal government to support it. And we were destroyed by a Prince Haji Van Aldik, who mysteriously appears on TV promising to make a donation of $1.3 billion to the UN SEAL program, and within 24 hours the media is running a story that he's a bogus prince, failed builder from Queensland, and the whole thing's a sham, and it embarrasses and destroys the whole UN SEAL program. It was set up by CIA, and I have all the records of court cases proving that he's working directly with CIA agents and Leo Wanta. But his bank was involved also with Leo Wanta and the Kuwait ambassador for moving the funds with Nick's bank. And the same ambassador owns a company called Ignite Inc. with Neil Bush, George Bush Sr., Barbara Bush, and many other mysterious players, Michael Milken, head of Drexel, and several Russian mafia billionaires. You can't make this up. Here is the letter from the bank, from the bogus prince, who comes to Australia to destroy us, to Leo Wanta, offering the services of his bank, the Bank of South Pacific Islands Limited. Here's a picture of him when he comes to Australia to destroy us. This is the same prince in CIA Operation Still Point with Leo Wanta. Here are letters from the bank, from the bogus prince, directly to William Jeffrey Clinton, Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, confirming that his bank's been used for moving billions of dollars of gold bullion. There's his bank again, and this time it's addressed to, again, Clinton, Rubin, National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, and there's a copy of the letter for the stabilisation of the Kuwait Dina. So this is overwhelming evidence. We've got Nick's bank being used with Leo Wanta, and Leo Wanta confirms that it's all been driven by George Bush Sr., and Nick confirms that he was approached by George Bush Sr. to move across and live in Virginia, set up his companies, and he's involved in all these transactions. And there you are. There is the ambassador to Spain, Kuwait, who's a director and founder of Ignite, founded by Neil Bush. And shareholders are George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr. and Barbara Bush, Michael Milken, and two Russian mafia billionaires. Here is a press release, 1987, that Leo Wanta's involved in selling guns, semi-automatic pistols from Belgium to Noriega. You can't make up this link. But this is the evidence that I uncovered. Nick always told me that he built the bunkers in Iraq, and it was funded by his bank, the Yuga Bank. And here is the confirmation. NO Project, a Yugoslavian construction firm that used Kissinger and Associates in 1980s when it had to build the contracts in Iraq. The Italian bank BNL, which maintained Kissinger as an advisor in 1980s when the bank provided Saddam Hussein Iraq with illegal loans. CIA Operation Steel Point, managed by Leo Wanta to money launder the arms, drugs and gold bullion using modified Promus software for Swift banking with Yugo Banker, Citibank and also the Prince's Bank in the Philippines to restabilise the Kuwait dinar currency after the invasion of Saddam Hussein. Here is the evidence of Project Superbase, the airbase that Nick's company, consortiums and banks were responsible for building the military bunkers, the fortified military facilities, shelters for bombers, fighters and military barracks, hardened aircraft shelters built, known as UGOS, the project, and they were the shelters that were destroyed by the GBU-28 laser-guided bunker buster bomb that you would have seen on TV. In 1992, after all this happens, President George H.W. Bush steps in with executive order and shuts down Nick's bank. Yugo Banker and Beogradska Banker, which was owned by the leader of Yugoslavia at the time, were all shut down by order of George H.W. Bush and seized $100 million. They had their bank subsidiary set up in New York. Isn't that interesting that he's invited to go across to America, involved in all the laundering of the funds and also the arms deals, and then they seize his bank? So Daniel Sheehan and both Danny CASOLARO were successfully exposing the octopus. And my evidence confirms that Danny CASOLARO had the smoking gun that signed checks of BCCI, motive 1 to kill him. If that's not enough, he holds a prospectus that shows that CIA, WACKENHUT, and Lawrence Barcella, really the fox within the Department of Justice as the attorney, is intimately involved in covering up all evidence being revealed by Daniel Sheehan's Christic Institute and the evidence that Danny CASOLARO is holding that will bring them down in the BCCI investigation, the signed BCCI checks, and also this prospectus that confirms that they were setting up a secret counter-terrorism and assassination team. It all overlapped with a company called Operational Systems Inc. It turns out that this company, founded by Ed Wilson, was actually caught spying on nuclear demonstrators. And it was shut down. It was involved by Daniel Sheehan in 1978. was spying on US citizens that were demonstrating in California. It was linked with EastCo Operational Systems, was founded by Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Joseph Capucci, Paul Wormley, and Thomas Castor. And Inslaws Inc.'s complete legal case talks about Paul Wormley being one of the directors of Simcom Inc., and the whole team came from Operational Systems Inc. It was a joint venture, and it was involved in setting up all of the monitoring of Kuwait airplanes for the royal family, Egyptian joint ventures, and it was a partnership and joint venture with Mossad. So this is the beginning of Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Thomas Clines, Richard Secord's alliance with Mossad. And it was linked to, it was a subsidiary of Trackor Inc., which also developed the missile fire control command systems for the Trident submarines, banking software, law enforcement software, covert intelligence surveillance services, and electronic spying devices. That's what it provided. Paul Wormley and Thomas Castor worked for that company, and then they formed Simcom Inc., which was acquired by Dr. Earl Bryan, and Hadron Inc. And Simcom Inc. and Hadron Inc. were contracted to develop the CIA DIA safe software known as Iris Swift banking software that was sold by Rupert Murdoch to Australia and renamed the Lean software. And the partnership for doing that was Wang Labs, Computer Power Group, and TRW, which runs Echelon. So Daniel CASOLARO had a smoking gun. This is the second motive for killing, because Lawrence Barcella, he would have known, was covering up all of the transactions of the Octopus relating to WACKENHUT, Hadron, theft of Inslaw's Promo software, but more important, Lawrence Barcella represented all the directors of BCCI that were arrested in Florida that were money laundering all of the funds of Noriega's drugs through Capcom, owned by the Kuwait royal family. Daniel Sheehan Acoustic Institute was a legitimate case. The Geo-Military Consultants Company providing the arms with Israel, North Korea, and they were acquiring all the guns through Poland. And that involved Nick's company and financed by Yuga Banker, Amco Group, linked to Colonel Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein with Kissinger and Associates. So the secret team was exposed by Michael to Daniel CASOLARO, were in behind the bombing of Pan Am 103. WACKENHUT provided the security for all of the baggage to be put on, carrying the bomb. They also provided security for Ishram Aboudi, given that the briefcase with the bomb with some clothing was found to have been purchased at the building adjacent to his office in Malta. It was also linked across with Carlos Cardone, supplying all of the landmines and technology and ventures, and also Stanford Technology with Secord and Hakem, linking back through Singlab with Wackel, hooked across to Singlab and Secord, and it was Lester Coleman that revealed the company called Overseas Press Services was involved in activities linked to the rescue of the hostages in Lebanon, and back to the McKee team, who were also involved in rescuing the hostages, but were coming back with the evidence that the secret team was involved in illegal trafficking of drugs from Lebanon back in through New York with the Gambino Mafia. Linked with Fidco, Pender, Mayhew and Murchison had contracts direct with the president and his family of Lebanon for reconstruction, but also they were behind all of the drugs coming through from Becker Valley. And of course, linking back to Duane Claridge and Vincent Canestrano running the CIA Counter-Terrorism Center. Now we've got evidence that Claridge was setting up his own private counter-terrorism and assassination team with WACKENHUT. That was the second smoking gun that Danny CASOLARO had. This secret team controlled all intelligence on drugs and terrorism, with Gray Company, Robert Gray, with Rogers, Livingston and Daniel Murphy. It's involved in representing BCCI, Project Hammer and CIA operations, Steel Point, and laundering the funds through the Vatican Bank, Guggenheim Bank, Banca Ambrosiano. Danny CASOLARO was going to Martinsburg to bring back the head of the OCTOPUS. He had 2 smoking guns, the signed BCCI checks with Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanafar involving Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, and the prospectus confirming the testimony of Gene Wheaton and also Jimmy Rothstein, New York detective, that Buck Revell was setting up a secret counter-terrorism assassination team with WACKENHUT and CIA operatives and Richard Secord. And the key attorney that was undermining Danny CASOLARO and undermining Daniel Sheehan with the Christic Institute is Lawrence Barcella. The other evidence that Daniel Sheehan had uncovered in his Christic Institute lawsuit was the involvement of Tom Posse and the CMA, and that it was involved in arms and drugs with the Iran-Contra and connected to assassination teams. Let me remind you that WACKENHUT, a secret counter-terrorism assassination team, Jimmy Rothstein confirms to me many times, recorded interviews with him over nearly 15 years, that it was Alexander Magnus who was running for President of the United States. They both met with Gene Wheaton, who confirmed that Oliver North and FBI Director Oliver Buck Revell were using Richard Secord, CIA operatives and WACKENHUT to set up their own secret counter-terrorism assassination team. Jimmy Rothstein confirms he never met Danny CASOLARO, so Danny CASOLARO's evidence vindicates the testimony of Gene Wheaton independently because it's a real prospectus document. Daniel Sheehan with his Christic Institute lawsuit also is doing the link of Owen Singlaub with the Iran-Contras. And my evidence independently, Robert Owen, Neil Livingston, Singlaub, Geomilitech, and the link back with William Casey is valid. I have proven through the corporate records and newspaper articles, but more important, my knowledge of Promus, that it started with Capucci and Associates with Operational Systems Inc. that became Simcom Inc. that was owned and acquired by Hadron Inc. in partnership with Wang Lab and Rupert Murdoch's company, developed the safe Swiss banking software for CIA and DIA. It was renamed the IRIS software, sold to the World Bank, IMF and the Club of Rome banks, but that also was sold back to Australia and renamed the Lean software, sold to the Australian Federal Attorney General, put into Austrac, which is equivalent of FinCEN, but also sold to ASIO, ASIS, and also DSD, which was linked to Echelon in Australia and the military, and it was put into all the banks to spy on every Australian citizen, their private records. And so Geomilitech, getting arms from Poland for the Iran-Contra, is substantiated, and I've validated that by being rescued by Nick Bandasevic. He was a good man to me, but he clearly was linked to CIA, Leo Wanter, George Bush, Richard Secord, Singlaub, and was the gateway for CIA operations. Still point for the money laundering, banks with the Kuwait royal family, and also was providing the arms links with the Soviet Union and South Africa and Central America. Robert Gray is all over this. Albert Haycom, Secord North, Poindexter with Gray & Co. Company. It is overwhelming evidence that Daniel Sheehan's legal case was destroyed within the United States undermined by a Department of Justice with Ed Meese, and together with Lawrence Barcella's links and the other officials that are on the secret teams, counter-terrorism and assassination team with WACKENHUT. And there's the confirmation that Singler, both Israel and Poland, were most interested in pursuing the role of trade arrangement, and that's where Nick comes in with his companies and banks. $80 million of explosives and arms, including C4. Lester Coleman, Daniel Sheehan independently identified a company involving Richard Secord and John Singlaub, which was discovered to be a warehouse of C4 explosives. And that was coming in from Poland with Geo-Militech Swiss bank accounts. The evidence is overwhelming that Daniel Sheehan and Danny CASOLARO were undermined. The octopus controlled justice, and it controlled the media, and it controlled the US government. The other part is Daniel Sheehan was exposing the defendant Tom Posse, involved in arms and drugs smuggling, and particularly relating back to defendant Posse with the bombing links with Ku Klux Klan and also the bombing of Continental Bank. Jimmy Rothstein told me independently Alexander Magnus and Jimmy were speaking with Gene Wheaton. Not only did they talk about that they're setting up a secret team, I just want to come back to this, the links with Edwin Meese, Poindexter. Lawrence Barcella is intimately involved with Ted Shackley. He also signed off on the approval for John Singlaub's company and Richard Secord to sell those arms from Poland to the Iran-Contra. More important, the link of Ted Shackley with President Ford and the mysterious appearance of Gerald Ford offering to negotiate $100 million settlement for me with John Hopkins fraud is no coincidence. Also, just coming back, Nick was the personal advisor to Colonel Gaddafi in Libya with his family there, and Ed Wilson is dealing directly, so is Ted Shackley with EastCo with Libya with Colonel Gaddafi. And now, in summary, Operation Illwind, it was launched as an investigation. It exposes Unisys, which is Sperry Group, Burroughs Group, headed by Frank Carlucci, and the person involved in the fraud. These are the contracts for the Trident submarine missile fire control systems, which is the first application of the Promus software. That independently confirms Michael's testimony that it was taken, the software tapes were taken to WACKENHUT Research Centre by Peter Wiednieks, modified by him. First application was for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines, and it was installed into the missile fire control systems for the Trident submarine. Melvin Paisley was responsible for that awarding of that contract, and the attorney representing this fraud case with convictions against Melvin Paisley is no other than Lawrence Barcella. Daniel CASOLARO knew that his prospectus document had hit pay dirt. He could see the cover-up and the corruption within. They controlled justice, they controlled the media, and that was the second motive. His prospectus document for the secret counter-terrorism and assassination team with WACKENHUT was the legal proof, the second motive for having him killed. It implicated Frank CARLUCCI, Dr. John Motley, DUANE CLARRIDGE and Loris Barcella. And it went right back to Peter Vignics with the awarding of the Aerostat radar contracts that were awarded to media baron Alan Bond, who's implicated in the Pentagon fraud contracts and receives a $6 million payment from Earl Bryan, delivered to Australia by Richard Babian, who's working for Richard Secord and Albert Hakem for Stanford Technologies in Virginia. The corruption is that they controlled all intelligence for war on drugs and terrorism. The OCTOPUS had infiltrated everything. The entire intelligence databases of DEA, Justice, FBI, CIA, DIA. And that means that they were protected with their drugs and armed enterprise. To continue money laundering through Guggenheim Bank, Banco Ambrosiano, Vatican Bank, BCICI, Citibank, using the CIA safe Swiss banking software. This in summary confirms the second motive for killing Danny CASOLARO, and overwhelming evidence that not only did they kill him, but they shut down the legitimate investigation by Daniel Sheehan and the Christic Institute to expose the secret team in the Iran-Contra scandal. And they were exposed by Daniel CASOLARO that Lawrence Barcella was representing Mervyn Paisley, who had organised all the contracts for the octopus companies in America and Israel for the major Pentagon billion-dollar fraud contracts. And if you recall, William Turner met with Daniel CASOLARO on the very last day and gave him 2 folders of documents on Pentagon fraud involving Hughes aircraft. So let's look at the summary of Gene Wheaton. Covert operations. He confirms Ted Shackley, Werner Walters, Frank CARLUCCI and Bing West, it's not Bing, it's Bing, used to meet on a park bench. And they said, with our expertise at placing dictators in power, why don't we treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over? And the first thing they did is they had their man, George H.W. Bush, put into White House as the Vice President and got him appointed in charge of the War on Drugs and Terrorism Task Force in Florida. There's the statement from Jimmy Rothstein to me that it was Alexander Magnus, who was a friend of Oliver North, financed Jimmy Rothstein and Chuck Hayes, and Chuck Hayes was talking directly to Daniel CASOLARO 2 weeks continuously before his death to investigate proof that his International Aid Donation Foundation was being used by Oliver North and Tom Posse for illegal drugs and arms trafficking for the Nicaraguan Contras. Christic Institute got it right. I have now confirmed the second motive for killing Danny CASOLARO is that he was exposing Ted Shackley, Frank CARLUCCI, DUANE CLARRIDGE and Lawrence Barcella. They'd had a secret team for counter-terrorism and assassination established with WACKENHUT. And Danny CASOLARO is the only person that held a copy of that prospectus and resumes of the founders. DUANE CLARRIDGE. The fraud case had caught them all. Christic Institute had caught them all. The secret team. I call it the 6th Eye because it wasn't just in America, it was international. My podcast show, The 6th Eye, was set up as Le Circle, and it involved banker Ambrosiano, Vatican Bank, P2 Lodge, Lucia Jolly, and also Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, Alexander Hay, William Wilson as the ambassador to the Vatican, Vernon Walters as a liaison direct to the Pope, Sabinsky, NSE, and billionaire David Rockefeller, and of course Henry Kissinger. And Crown Prince Otto of Austria, the rightful heir to the Roman Empire. And Carlo Presenti, financing the neo-Nazi groups in Italy, and also Vice President of banker Ambrosiano with Robert Calvi and Michel Sindona. This is a fascist group of people in the name of the Knights of the Malta, Opus Dei, secret group, had infiltrated all intelligence and banking. It was a long game, and it was done well. They undermined the credible efforts of Daniel Sheehan and the Christic Institute to prosecute, remove their registration as a tax-deductible vehicle, so the bankrupt them, so they couldn't prosecute their legal cases, destroy him, and it cost Danny CASOLARO his life because he held the smoking gun, 2 of them, signed BCCI checks, Monte Carlo transactions for the payments, and the resumes of the WACKENHUT secret counter-terrorism and assassination team set up. And Lawrence Barcella, responsible for the Fox in the Department of Justice and all legal cases. Second motive was this document, never seen before. It was existing in the documents and research files of Daniel CASOLARO, accessible to FBI, accessible to the United States Department of Justice, Zipperstein investigation, and the Martinsburg police, who ruled that there was never a motive for killing Danny CASOLARO, and there were no evidence of any threats made against him. I'll let the public decide whether they think that's true, because this should have been on the front pages of all newspapers. The BCCI signed checks should have been on the front pages within a week. This document should have been covered by the leading journalists in America. This was the smoking guns of a secret team and their corruption. So I'm going to finish off and let you look at the John Pilger interview with the founder of Counter-Terrorism Consultants, with the directors of WACKENHUT, DUANE CLARRIDGE, and what he was doing to support dictators with the secret team by setting up the death squads with John Singwell, Richard Secord, Ted Shackley, to murder innocent people, including Catholic priests, nuns, teachers, and round up dissidents and have them murdered in the name of national security.
DUANE CLARRIDGE was head of the CIA's Latin American division in the early 1980s.
Chile, the only reason it exists is because of Pinochet.
At a huge human price.
What human price? Give me a break.
The thousands who were disappeared and murdered.
Thousands? You count them. What thousands?
Well,
and
I've
don't
seen...
talk to me about truth commissions.
I've seen their names in the cemetery in Santiago.
Yeah,
you're saying
there
their
aren't thousands.
faces.
There aren't thousands.
Well,
There aren't thousands, sir.
It was a period in which almost everybody in the present situation regards as a dark time, in which the CIA played a major role.
That's right. They played a major role in overthrowing, what's his name?
What's his name was Salvador Allende.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
He was democratically elected.
Right. Okay.
Is that okay to overthrow a democratically elected government? Is it okay?
It depends on what your national security interests are.
Are you denying that Pinochet caused huge suffering in that country?
I don't buy. That he committed crimes, I agree.
But it's worth it.
Huh?
Is that what you're saying? Those crimes are worth it?
Yeah. Sometimes, unfortunately, things have to be changed in a rather ugly way.
According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human...
well, come on, John. This is where we're going. You're wasting my time. That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
So it was bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years. You're taking the stuff from these propaganda mills. And I'm not interested.
What are the propaganda mills?
All these things, this truth thing and all that. They're nothing but propaganda mills.
Do you really think they're...
I know so.
Are they all conning us, lying us? Yeah, Amnesty International?
Amnesty International's right in the middle of it.
What right have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries? What
National
right?
security interests.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say in this.
Yeah, well, that's just tough. We are going to protect ourselves, and we're going to go on protecting ourselves because we end up protecting all of you. And let's not forget that.
Right. Right? No, I won't.
We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it. Get used to it, world. We're not going to put up with nonsense. And if our interests are threatened, we're going to do it.